very flattering introduction. But I would go just one step back, because if we want to understand the future of VCs, and this is like the main topic for this year, obviously there won't be any VCs if there are no entrepreneurs who come up with bold ideas, risky ideas that need financing. So I would like to go back a little bit and talk a little bit about this issue. In taking the Hungarian example, in Hungary we were among the EU countries probably the first one to jump on the Yerbey program that was mentioned many times in the first round, and lot of money was poured into this program, both governmental and private. So there is now, I would say, an abundance of VC financing in Hungary. At the same time, we saw a lot of problems with that, because both the private investors that came from usually very traditional areas of private investment, like banking, real estate, and thought that, okay, this is something new, this is a lot of talk about it, so let's do it. But as you need to, as Pekka mentioned, as you need to educate people to become inventors, you need to educate people also to be VC managers. And this is a problem in every place. In Israel, like 20-something years ago when they started Yozma, that was exactly one of the main goals, to educate the local investors into that direction. Now here the education went quite well, but definitely these two issues are very important. So how to educate people to become entrepreneurs, how to make the entrepreneurship not just fashionable, but also to be acceptable for the society at large. We were talking about issues like handling of failure, and let's say in most of the European societies, and I don't know how is that in the Arab societies, but failure is something not viewed as in the US or in Israel. Failure is viewed as a human tragedy, as something that you are a fallen guy. You shouldn't do anything further in your life because you failed once. Now we have to change that, and in Europe this is very important. And I've seen some nodding here from you that probably in traditional societies like the Arab society, this is also, I assume, is a problem. So here we have to change things, and this is the big question, because VCs are very important, but they come afterwards. And actually, I would be interested in hearing your. Mostly the Europeans. In Israel it's different, in the US different, but the Europeans, how do you see that this, is this changing, and how you can accelerate this process so that entrepreneurship and the different conditions for that from the side of the society in general, the acceptance of that special way of living, I would say, not just doing business but of living, and what do you think about how we can make a change there? So I am not the moderator here, and sorry to take over, but I would be very much interested in a quick round of how do you see that in your case, in Holland, in the Arab societies, Arab countries, in Germany, and there are some other European countries, but they are not represented here around this table. So maybe just us here. And also, I would be interested in whether you see any trend in the creation of ideas, whether this is also, and this is also something fundamental before VCs come in, what are the trends in creating ideas, creating innovations, creating startups in general?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for taking the lead. We will obviously respond to the mentality question as well. I find it difficult talking about mentalities because it's always, the people are so different and they're so individual different, and you can always say, what have two people in common? What have Britney Spears and Bill Gates in common? They're both American. It's getting difficult sometimes. And whether they share the same mentality. One thing that must be said about Europe is now it's places such as Amsterdam or Berlin, they become truly international. So in Berlin, people in the VC scene, the startup scene, they do speak English. And people from all over Europe and from even beyond come to Berlin. And there's lots of young Israeli now who return to Berlin, which is good to see, I must say. And I don't know whether it was big news in Germany. There was a demonstration yesterday going on in front of the Brandenburg Gate against anti-Semitism. And in the first row, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, German President Joachim Gauck, and the Minister of Economy and a Labour chairman we walked in front. I think there is, and they want to make it possible that Jews and people from all over the world. There's also a huge Arab community and Turkish community in Germany and growing Arab community in Germany. I do think that is changing. It's becoming a more global world, and therefore I guess mentality will change as follows. Second part is, so then I finish with Germany, is like when kids leave school, they used to go to do military service, male, young, or civil service instead. Now that's all been abolished. What they now do is they take a gap year. So they don't start university at once, but they go travel around the world, work and travel in Australia, but also in South America, Latin America. They are in Africa, they're all over the world, and that will change the world fundamentally, I'm convinced. And they compete in Australia with people from all over the world for the same waiter jobs. So we'll see how the world will look. It will certainly be different. But the mentality is right. In Germany, failure is not good traditionally, and we hope we can help and consult the young entrepreneurs that as little as possible will happen, and as many as possible of them will come through. Because it's the good examples, the Bill Gates and the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world that inspire.
I think, aside from the failure issue, I think in the Arab world there's a much more important element. As I mentioned, the last 3 years have witnessed an uprising when it comes to startups and funds. And I'll give you an example. In Kuwait, for example, which is a very rich Gulf country, 95% of the working Kuwaitis are working for the government, in the public sector, 95%. So only 5% work in the private sector. 75% of the budget goes to salaries. So this is a serious problem, a very serious problem. Now, the government, came up with an initiative to solve this problem. So they created a Kuwait National Fund. It's $7 billion. So it's there's no issue of money. I sit on the board of that fund of Kuwait. The same thing we have in Oman. The same thing. I'm involved in all these initiatives in the Gulf. But the fundamental question: do these countries really want entrepreneurship? Because my understanding of entrepreneurship is independence. Is the thinking becomes a totally independent way of thinking, and it's challenging, and doesn't accept things to be parachuted on them. And that's unlike the mentality of the governments in the Middle East. The mentality of the governments in the Middle East is, I'm your father. I take care of you. I know what's best for you. And I hire you in the government, and I pay for your wedding, and I pay for your house, and I pay for everything. Okay, that's been the case for the last 100 years. Okay, now to shift automatically to an ecosystem where the young people are independent, I think this whole hype about entrepreneurship and startups came as a result of the Arab Spring. As we all know, the Arab Spring changed a lot of things in the Arab world. I mean, people never thought that Hosni Mubarak and Zain al-Abidin bin Ali and Gaddafi will disappear from the scene. Nobody, I mean, if you asked anybody before the Arab Spring that this is going to happen, they will say you are crazy, you're drinking something, okay? So after that happened, and after the Arab Spring, suddenly the decision makers in the MENA region discovered there's something called youth, because in the MENA region, 70% are below 34, 50% are below 25. This is not the case in Europe or North America. So when you have 70% of the population below 34, well, guess what? There's a serious problem. And that's why we see this huge momentum and move in the Arab world towards so-called startups and accelerators and incubators and trying to come up with an attempt. But personally, until this now, I don't genuinely believe that the governments believe in this. I think the governments are afraid of having this new wave of young entrepreneurs and seeing these big success stories of exits, and suddenly the economy becomes totally uncontrollable. Because the way the economy runs right now in the Arab world, it's fully controlled. The governments have upper hand. If you go into the economy of the WhatsApp and the Planet Internet and the Alibabas and all of that, that's a totally different economy. If you look at the States now, the top 10 companies in the US are not the companies that we saw 20, 30 years ago. Totally different. While in the region, it's a conventional economy, and I don't think the region is ready to accept that there are new tycoons emerging from kids who suddenly became the decision makers and shaping the whole future of the region. I don't think that's there yet. So I think this is more critical in the region, in our region, the MENA region, when it comes to failure or not failure, even though it's an issue, but I think this is a much bigger issue. It's a much more fundamental issue.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, actually, because it gives me I have a perspective on it which I can share. I find that again, I've been living in the Netherlands for 5 years. This is my home. And I've had enough time to kind of take an evaluation of the culture and learn a lot about it. And one thing I think is unique about the Dutch is that they're quite open-minded, quite reflective, self-reflective. And so I see that they adopt some of the best habits of countries around the world, and they seem to pick up some of the fewest habits that are bad. So I see a lot of potential for Amsterdam and for the Netherlands in particular to become a technology center to really grow. When it comes to the situation regarding the failure, even when I entered the accelerator program, there's, I guess probably most people know about Steve Blank and the Lean Startup and the mantra of fail fast, fail quick, fail often. That was not really heard of just 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So now everybody knows that and is adapting it. So I know that the entrepreneurs for sure, they understand this now, and people I think around them as well do. So the stigma is going away quickly. And there's the support I see from the government now by approving, assistance for startup companies with the strict specification that there will be no recourse for individuals should the company go under. For the first time, you're not responsible for that debt should the company go under. So now the government is moving behind and backing that. So I think I think it'll quickly change and will become more like the U.S., the good part of the U.S. system.
Let's see how experienced Israeli venture capitalists view Europe. Does Europe change? Have you registered that? Is there a mentality change going on, or should it be left out?
Well, I have no way of telling it. I would like to lighten it from a different perspective. We're talking about Europe as if it's sick or it suffers from a lack of entrepreneurship. And I wish we had many of the things that Europeans have in terms of working moral, productivity, industrialism. I'll give you an example. Recently, I watched the Inequality for All movie, and I recommend it to everybody, Professor Reich. And he asked an amazing question. He asked there, and those of you in the audience that saw it, please do not respond. But he asked a question. He asked every iPhone that is sold around the globe, which are the 2 countries that make the most money out of an iPhone sold? Now, if I would ask an unaided questionnaire in the audience, people will say it's probably the US because Apple is from Cupertino. And then they will say probably China because they make it there. And the 2 nations that make the most money are Germany and Japan. Now, this is shocking when you hear about it. You say, how come? And apparently, production of the iPhone requires some certain industrial skills that only if you build an infrastructure for tens and hundreds of years of educating industrialists in the right way, you can produce such a quality. So that's why the profit margins of the Germans and the Japanese portions of the iPhone are the biggest. Employment is not the biggest portion here in the iPhone in terms of revenue margins. So my only minor contribution is to say I will not be presumptuous to say how the future will look and how the future of VC is, and I agree with what Laszlo said. I think that entrepreneurship can come from a young industrialist that establishes Nokia, and we heard a very blunt and honest analysis of why Nokia failed because of arrogance and other things that happen also to high-tech companies, and we've seen so many monsters and so many entrepreneurs, by the way, that after they raised their first A round from Americans, they started traveling business class and buying all kinds of equipment and laptops for themselves, and they lose their company in a short while. I think that to some extent, I live very well and I enjoy and I love and admire the Israeli high-tech scene. But at the end of the day, entrepreneurship and high-tech investments in Israel is an industry that lives on steroids. To a certain extent, it's not the natural course of business. I don't know how to put it in a short brief, in the short time that we have. So I would not fall in love too much with the fact. I think that some nations, and again, I don't have the answer to it, why Israel is so good at entrepreneurship, why China is so good at it, why the US is so good, while others are not that great. Japan is not that great, and I think I heard somewhere that Japan does not have many Nobel Prize winners. The Jews have lots of them. Okay, so what? It seems like it's a huge, huge problem for them. I think that we should, with human beings, and you said it rightfully, it depends on the people. I think that nations have their own DNA. And changing a DNA of a nation is a very, very troubled thing. I don't know if every government should try and change the DNA of its nation. I think it should work on the merits and the strength of its own people.
We're seeing this firsthand with the entrepreneurs that we're dealing with. Imagine you're basically educating somebody about what is entrepreneurship, what is a venture capital fund, and at the same time, you're talking about the fundamentals, and you say one of the fundamentals is that you might fail. Actually, there's a good risk that you will fail. It is true, I agree with you and with Abdul Malik, that there is this perception of how will I be perceived in the community if I do not fail, if I do not make it with this project. This is part of what we're trying to do. I mean, and part of what we're trying to do is to get into the minds of these amazing, academically outstanding people and say, look, you have to take the risk. There is a good risk that you will fail. And if you look at the venture capital world, what's the ratio? Is 1 to every 10 that you have a success, or even more? It's something that we deal with, we face. What we try to do, for example, in our fund is to put these entrepreneurs in touch with mentors and other people who have went through the process of going through an exit and opening a company, failing once, failing twice, but then really succeeding the last time. And you see that it's starting to have an impact. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he raised the idea, what would happen if, this company closes? He said, what happened? This is part of an ecosystem. That's how you build it. You build it by opening companies, but you can't have a fund that has, 20 portfolio companies and every one of them is a rocket internet. It's not going to happen. So it's there, and I think it's just part of the process that, will take time until we eventually get to the point where people are okay and comfortable with that mindset.